Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion, Elections in the Age of AI. I'm Lance Ignon, Senior Associate Dean of Communication at the USC Price School of Public Policy. Today's discussion is moderated by Mindy Romero, Assistant Professor of Research at the Price School and founder and director of the school's Center for Inclusive Democracy. The center is one of the nation's foremost nonpartisan research centers focused on elections, voting behavior, and voting participation. Professor Romero is broadcasting today from USC's new Capitol campus in the heart of Washington, D.C. A few housekeeping matters before I turn things over to Professor Romero. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. The panelists will do their best to respond to as many as possible in our allotted time. However, this webinar does not allow for questions submitted verbally to the panelists. A recording of today's event will be available in about a week on the Center for Inclusive Democracy's website and on the YouTube channel for the Price School. With that, let me turn things over to Professor Romero.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Mindy Romero, Director of the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy at the Seoul Price School. Today's webinar, of course, is Elections in the Age of AI. For your information, we have put in the chat the agenda for today. We will begin with a brief presentation by me, kind of giving everyone an overview of AI, make sure everybody's kind of on the same page in terms of the start of the conversation. And then we have, of course, a fantastic panel joined by three esteemed experts, Jonathan Methenstein, the Executive Director of California Common Cause, Evan Harris, Chancellor's Public Scholar, UC Berkeley, Continuing Lecturer, Haas School of Business, and Michaela, and I'm going to potentially damage your name, I apologize, Padithering, Elections and Government Counsel, Brennan Center, and please do correct me when we come to the panel. Let me give you just one other piece of information before I begin. And that is that this webinar, of course, is recorded. The recording itself, along with some additional resources for those of you that might want to learn more about this topic or to examine more deeply some of the items that are discussed by the panelists, that's all going to be available later. We're going to send it out to everybody that's registered. It's also going to be available on CID's website. So we welcome you to share that recording and those resources, and certainly hopefully revisit them as well if you find them of interest. So to start, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. To set the stage here, we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and we're specifically generative AI. There's been a lot of conversation, of course, as of late in the media about AI, both its potential benefits. And we want to note today that, yes, of course, there can be many benefits in various sectors of our society and around the world. But today we're focused on the concerns around AI and our democracy. So the impacts of artificial intelligence on U.S. democracy. Of course, this is an emerging set of impacts, and much research needs to be done for us to better understand just exactly what the impact is on public opinion, public trust, potentially public behavior in our democracy, in our institutions, as well as potentially impact on elections and elections outcome. Today, we're not talking about any of that. Well, some of our panelists may be, but we're talking more broadly about our democracy and the various ways that institutions, right, can be potentially impacted by AI. All right, starting. So the impact on AI, specifically through misinformation and really disinformation is our focus today. Disinformation, of course, is really the deliberate attempt, right, to manipulate the public by using half-truths, inaccurate information, non-rational arguments, usually for a purpose, not always for a purpose, but the idea is to manipulate public behavior, public opinion. Political disinformation can span a wide spectrum from stories that might seem credible, might seem potentially even logical, to those that are completely unbelievable on their face, right? People would question them or flat out even excuse them or dismiss them, but it still can be political disinformation. It's always been, forms of disinformation have always been present in our US democracies from the earliest days in our campaigns. That is nothing new, but as technology has evolved, disinformation, of course, has become more subtle. It's often difficult for individuals to identify, even people who feel that they are really plugged in terms of the level of information or education that they have on a particular topic. It can be difficult to identify and define. And now with generative AI, can find itself turbocharged, right? And that's really a lot of what we're talking about today is the turbocharging or potential turbocharging of AI, of disinformation through generative AI. So how does disinformation threaten democracy? So democracies depend on informed citizens and residents that participate fully or as fully as possible and express their opinions and their needs, right? Through the ballot box, through and directly to their elected officials, through other aspects, right, in our democracy as well, and through our institutions. It can decrease distrust. The concern is decreasing distrust or trust levels, I should say, in democratic institutions, can interfere with electoral processes, foster incivility, polarization. And as we've known for a very long time, and I think really publicly been discussing quite actively since 2016, it can be a tool for foreign interference in politics. So disinformation can be a tool for foreign interference in politics. Disinformation can come from third parties, but also, of course, generated by political leaders, campaigns for their own political gain. And again, this is where I refer you to the note at the beginning about it being a spectrum in terms of how easy or how hard it is to detect, right, different opinions, certainly, and perspectives on what is disinformation versus what is the truth. And disinformation can impact levels of participation and equitable representation. Just really quickly, a few images here just for time. Both well-known governmental buildings here on the left and the right. The one that is fake is on the left. If we had more time, I'd ask you all to take a little poll and ask you to guess on some of these images. But at the same time, we don't want to linger and help promote them either. So here are some images of the former president of the United States and Dr. Fauci. Obviously noting the ones that are fake, if you will. Here, a story about Biden calling for a national draft, right? Men and women being sent to Ukraine. Again, just going through these quickly. And here's some images of the former president and presumptive Republican nominee. And both of these are fake as well, are generated, right? Okay, how can disinformation impact equitable participation? Well, different communities can get targeted in different ways and for different purposes, particularly communities of color, low-income communities, communities that may be limited English speaking. Disinformation can sow possibly discord or discontent, right, between and among groups, if that is indeed the intent. Sometimes the intent isn't even there, but that still can happen or potentially can happen. And sometimes disinformation is used to suppress a population or just simply a group's participation. Widespread misinformation or disinformation can lead to collective preferences that are far different from those that would exist if people were correctly informed, right, about the wide, or correctly informed, or at least a wide divergence between groups that is fueled by targeting. So example, thinking about racial and social justice issues, fueling concerns about those issues in both liberal and conservative circles, platforms. We saw this in the 2020 campaign, presidential campaign. We've seen it many other places as well, of course. Misinformation and disinformation can thrive during change or confusion. So an example, of course, the pandemic in 2020, where people were literally concerned about survival, the safety of their families and their loved ones. We had to figure out, and I say we, the collective we in the elections field, had to figure out how to put on an election during COVID. There were changes in voting laws, for that to occur. The pandemic necessitated an increase in ballot access, as we know, as many Americans across the country utilized vote by mail for the first time. But in that environment, it was an environment that could and did lend itself to disinformation quite substantially. And as I mentioned already, those who often face barriers, language barriers, distrust our democratic systems and lack technology access. And we're talking the broad brushstrokes here, of course. Challenges can be more significant, and often the government needs to help identify and avoid disinformation because the challenge in these communities can be more significant. Access to media in language, for instance, that is focused on these issues. Of course, there's lots of fantastic ethnic media sources in our state and across the country that do tremendous work in communities. But many of them are, if not all of them, are under-resourced, to some degree. And so the challenge of being targeted potentially, the challenge for resource allocation, or at least the acknowledgement of under-resourced, being under-resourced, can just add additionally to all of this. And I think the conversation today, a lot of it will be about the potential around government. Where does it need to act to help communities, identify and avoid disinformation? Again, for immigrants and communities of color, these groups are often cut off from the mainstream news sources, have greatest resources to debunk deepfakes, other disinformation, can prefer online engagement in their native languages where moderation and fact-checking are less prevalent, and disinformation aimed at immigrant communities is poorly understood and difficult to track and counteract, or it can be in many circumstances, not all. Yet it is getting easier and easier to create. Bottom line, we need to be able to recognize and ignore disinformation. Ignore is a word that is easily said, as opposed to being done. It's not a bad thing to be skeptical of political news, I would argue, period. But obviously, if the news doesn't seem quite right, if it's sensationalized, if it invokes really strong emotions, for instance. But at the same time, sometimes, as I think I noted at the beginning, it's not always easy to tell what is something that you should be maybe skeptical about, curate news from trusted sources. These are things that people can do and are often part of the conversation around counteracting disinformation, particularly in the age of AI. Determine whether an article is news or opinion. That also is difficult as people are information low in general and very busy, in their daily lives to be able to figure out what is a credible news source. What is a credible news source obviously can vary quite substantially across demographics. Track time, confirm across multiple sources. Same thing as I said a moment ago in terms of the difficulty. The need is there, but the difficulty is high. And beware of emotions. People protecting themselves against disinformation can be hard. It's a lot of work. And generally here, the push in this field is to talk about how government and policymakers can take action to support communities, and really where and how and to what degree is really much of the conversation. And I think what we're going to be covering in our conversation today to some extent. Thank you. Now I'm going to go ahead and move us over to our panel. Again, we're very fortunate to have three really nationally recognized experts in this in the field of AI, in the conversation of AI and our democracy. We're going to start with, again, just quick introductions. In your chat, you will see the links to their bios. So I won't give a full bio. I'm just going to introduce their name and titles, and then we'll get into the actual conversation. So Jonathan Methenstein, Executive Director, California Common Cause. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us. David Evan Harris, Chancellor's Public Scholar, UC Berkeley Continuing Lecturer, Haas School of Business. Thank you, David, very much for joining us. And Michaela, and I fear that I did not do justice to your last name. Would you kindly correct me?
Michaela Pentataranana.
Thank you. Elections and Government Counsel, Brennan Center. All right, so jumping in, this first question is for all three of our panelists. I'll ask Jonathan to take it first, and then David and Michaela. Please discuss what's at stake for US democracy and democracies around the world regarding the advancement of AI. And as you address that topic in the 3 minutes or so that I'm going to give you each, please also touch on how your organization is working to address these concerns. Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you, Mindy. And thank you to USC and for the host today in setting up this conversation, which is critically important as we head into the second half of this election year. I think what, for me, is really important to recognize as we frame this conversation is that all of the challenges that we're going to talk about today regarding AI and its ability to turbocharge disinformation come in the context of a democracy that is already weakened at all levels of our government, and with trust in our institutions at all-time lows, with trust in our media declining amongst the public, with truth under assault seemingly across the country, and with deep voter participation disparities that indicate no matter all the progress we make in California and elsewhere, certain communities do not see themselves as represented in and invested in our democratic process. And so it's in that challenging environment we're now entering this first AI election. And Mindy, you mentioned earlier that disinformation has existed for ages and ages and ages, and that's true. What's different now is that disinformation at scale used to be laborious, difficult, required technical expertise or some form of savvy. Today, the tools available are so powerful, so accessible, so easy to use that just about anyone, from candidates to conspiracy theorists to foreign states to online trolls, have the tools they need to deceive voters and to destabilize our information ecosystems. And we're already seeing this, as Mindy alluded to, there have been examples of this all over the world, from Bangladesh to Slovakia to Pakistan to Argentina to India, and closer to home, of course, the Joe Biden robocall and the Republican elections. But if you look at some of these other countries, they're really, really instructive. In India, for example, political deepfakes have swamped the market. They're being used by candidates. They're being used to oppose candidates. They're being used by everyone. Everyone is seeing them. And very, very quickly, it is transforming the information ecosystems in the country. And my fear is that the American public is simply not prepared, right? So we do not have an adequate level of skepticism about our political information. And Mindy made reference to this. I think we are moving into an era in which if you see an image or video or audio that makes someone's point too perfectly, that confirms a conspiracy theory, that plays out perfectly for one candidate or attacks another candidate, we are in an era in which instead of believing it, instead of retweeting it, instead of sharing it, you are going to have to go and double check it. You're going to have to go Google it, see if it's being reported by other sources, see if it's been debunked. If you see false audio of an elections official caught on tape saying that their voting machines can be hacked, this audience today for this webinar is probably savvy enough to know that that's the sort of thing you have to go and check. But we're going to have to get the word out among the public and community at large in California and across the country that everyone needs to level up their BS meters, frankly, in this election. And I'll just say that in the absence of congressional action on this, I mean, there's activity in Congress, but we're skeptical that something meaningful will actually pass. Something that's nuanced enough and broad enough and powerful enough to really address this problem at scale. And we don't see the social media platforms as a source of solutions on this. While there are some tech companies that are doing positive things, that are dipping their toes into solutions that can strengthen our information ecosystems, we think California has an opportunity to lead and to take the bold, aggressive steps that our democracy needs in this moment. So California Common Cause, founded in 2023, something called the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy. That's called CITED for short. The link to our website is in the chat. And our goal is to find powerful solutions for AI-powered disinformation and other emerging threats, emerging digital threats to our democracy that we can pass in California and that we can then use to lead the nation and drive nationwide change. So there's plenty more to say, but I'll leave it there for my colleagues on the panel.
David?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Mindy. This is really an honor to be here. Jonathan saved me a lot of time because he said a lot of things I was going to say. So thanks, Jonathan. I'm maybe going to drop a few additional terms here. One is one from Zeynep Tufekci in a book called Twitter and Tear Gas, which I teach at Berkeley in my classes. It's called Networked Authoritarians. And I think we really have to, in particular, acknowledge the role of networked authoritarians who are authoritarian leaders who are really good at technology. And these networked authoritarians took a lot of what for a long time I and many others believed was the magic of social media, these powerful tools that could potentially be amazing tools for advancing human rights, advancing democracy, and turn them on their head, and are actually using the tools of social media to suppress democracy and make themselves look more popular than they actually are, suppress dissent, spread false information. And this is happening in every world region. I worked at Facebook for almost 5 years. When I was on a team called the Civic Integrity Team, I actually worked to chase these networked authoritarians all over the world. They're in every world region. And I really studied their tactics, studied how they worked, and tried to figure out how to take down their operations. Succeeded in some cases, but it's very hard to get all of them. And with the advent of generative AI tools, you really couldn't dream up a better technology to serve the needs of the networked authoritarian. Whereas Putin and the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg that operated, at least we know, starting in 2015 and 2016 to disrupt the US election, whereas they had about 1,000 people reportedly coming to work every day in an office building to generate fake content and subvert elections around the world. You could do that work with a lot less people. And you might think, oh, well, there are also better defenses now, right? It's 8 years later, it's 2024. Well, no, actually, the opposite is true. And there's a great report that uses this term, the big tech backslide. And I'll send out a link to everyone. This comes from the Free Press, and it documents the way that we're seeing a retreat from the social media platforms in their previous commitments to defend democracy and defend elections. And that's a really big problem because you have this new threat of AI and a retreat of the people that we would need to protect us from those threats. Now, there's something that really bothers me, and it's something that I've heard from both Democrats and Republicans in the United States Congress, and it's a narrative that goes something like this. I've collected over a dozen examples of it, thanks to my student research assistants at Berkeley. We're combing through lots of documents on this, but the narrative is, we failed to regulate social media, so we can't fail again on AI. And I want to correct that misconception. It's not that we failed to regulate social media, it's that every single minute of every single day, the United States is continuing to fail to regulate social media. And even if we got it right on AI, and even if we put every sensible regulation to protect democracy from AI in place, they won't work without addressing social media. And what am I doing about this? So I've spent the last year trying to find ways to help policymakers advance policies around social media and AI that will help protect democracy and protect children, protect human rights. And I'm doing this at a lot of different levels. I've advised the United Nations, the EU, the White House, Congress, the California legislature, the Arizona Secretary of State. And I'm doing this with nonprofit organizations and civil society groups. I'm an advisor to both the organizations that Jonathan and Michaela are representing here, Cited and the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, and also with the International Computer Science Institute at Berkeley and the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. And in particular, I'm focusing a lot of my energy right now on two jurisdictions that I think have the greatest potential to really make an impact in the world through policy. And that's the European Union, and in particular Brussels. I've been to Brussels twice in the past 9 months, and I'm planning another trip right now. I've found that the European Commission and the people who are responsible now for enforcing the EU's Digital Services Act, which I would argue is the most important legislation about actually about social media and AI. It doesn't use the term AI, it uses the term algorithmic systems, but it applies to both. That's a really critically important tool for democracy and protecting elections, and also the EU AI Act. And then I'm spending even more of my time in Sacramento, here in California, where I live, working with Cited to help advance a package of bills that are all focused on protecting our democracy. So I'll leave it there for now.
Sure. There's rightly a lot of focus on the information environment from policymakers and civil society, but even within that bucket, you have different aspects that are receiving more or less attention. So, of course, you have AI-generated information that is damaging to candidates, which is where a lot of the legislative focus is. But you could also have AI-generated information that is damaging to election officials and the elections process. And you have the potential for AI-worsened voter suppression attempts through more sophisticated persuasion techniques executed on a larger scale, potentially on a longer time horizon as well. And even beyond the information environment and disinformation, you also have, we're seeing now, depending on how you define AI exacerbated mass challenges to voters' registration status, AI exacerbated cybersecurity risks and opportunities associated with the use of AI in election administration. That's not just generative AI, but also the more traditional use of AI to process and synthesize information without necessarily creating wholly new content. So in terms of what we're doing, since last year, we at the Brennan Center have published a flagship AI and Democracy essay series in collaboration with Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Some of the focus of that is, of course, deepfakes and the information environment, but it also includes a number of areas that we think are underexamined, relatively speaking. We recognize that expertise in election administration and the societal impact of AI typically sit in different corners of the policy and academic world. So we asked experts from across these communities to examine the intersection of these issues. And we explore topics like election security, the impact of AI on election security, the public comment process and participatory democracy, political advertising and fundraising, election administration, voter suppression, and the information environment for elections. And there are a number of policy recommendations in that series, as well as steps, other kinds of steps that tech companies and civil society actors can undertake in order to minimize the significant dangers of AI that AI poses for elections, as well as to increase any positive impacts of these tools for elections and democracy writ large. We've also, over the past year, been engaging with policymakers, Congress, as well as state legislatures around the country to inform bills at the intersection of AI and democracy. As I've said, a lot of the focus is on visual AI, political deepfakes, but we've also been encouraging policymakers to look at other issues, including vote suppression, election security, and the use of AI in election administration. And then, David touched on this, but we have also helped to run tabletop training exercises with election officials and other key stakeholders to game out some of the potential scenarios and threats and challenges to election security and administration that are posed by AI. So we had one in Arizona, and that David helped with, and others that are planned, and will continue to provide resources to election officials as we work on this issue going forward.
Thank you very much. And also, I should just note again, we've got in the chat links to some of the work that Michaela just discussed, that the Brennan Center has produced, those reports, and as well as a link to the initiative cited, which is part of the California Common Cause organization, and then also a report that David cited. So if you joined us late, we've put all that information in the chat again. So next question. And I'm going to ask this of David and Michaela, and really you can take this in any direction that you'd like. We're talking again about the concerns, right? Deep concerns around the potential for AI, generative AI, on our democracy as a negative. Are there positives? Does generative AI present any positives for our democracy? Before we continue on in the conversation, either one of you would like to talk about that. So, for instance, can AI in some ways help voters actually make more informed decisions? Or perhaps you want to talk about go in another direction. Please, David or Michaela.
I'm happy to address that one. So, this is a kind of a personal question for me. There's no stage in my life where I would have raised my hand and said, I'm a techno optimist. But looking back reflexively, I had a techno optimist phase. And that started in maybe around 2010, really. It started with the Occupy movement, which I found really, really exciting and interesting, and Arab Spring, and this emergence of really what looked like great potential to use technology as a tool for expanding democracy for social movements. I teach a class at Berkeley called Civic Technology. I teach another called Social Movements and Social Media. And really that was the gist of those two classes for a long time, is how do different movements, how do activists, how do civil society organizations leverage tech to be better at what they can do. And I also worked for a decade at a think tank called the Institute for the Future, where I helped launch something called the Governance Futures Lab, and that's still around. I'll drop a link to that. And through the Governance Futures Lab, I worked with people from around the world to help prototype new ideas about how tech could be used to bolster democracy, to extend democracy, to make democracy more accessible. And I spent a lot of time in particular on this one. We called it an artifact from the future. It was a prototype of something that doesn't exist today, but something that you would find if you traveled forward in time and came back. And that prototype was called App for Gov, and I'll send a link to that also. But I imagined this with my colleagues, imagined this interface where you could have daily conversations with your elected officials, where you could participate in real time with hearings, suggesting to your elected officials questions that they could ask in real time, where you could call votes and amongst your peers and submit that information very quickly to your elected officials, where your elected officials could consult you on even the smallest decisions that they face and have a guarantee that they're getting information from you. And when I joined Facebook in 2018, I actually joined to work on these kinds of issues on something called the Civic Engagement Team. And the Civic Engagement Team made a product that I think still exists today called Facebook Town Hall. And that was a tool to help people use their Facebook accounts to get in touch with their elected officials. And it actually gave elected officials a badge that verified that the people writing comments on their page actually were in their district. And quickly, within a couple of months of my joining, Cambridge Analytica, the scandal rocked the company, and so many of the resources that were set aside to work on civic engagement, work on these cool tools for people to see videos about the candidates running for election and learn more about their candidates. All of these exciting things went from need to have priorities that were heavily invested into nice to have things, until we could figure out how to stop the next Cambridge Analytica and stop the next Russian hacking of the US election, and then stop things like that all over the world. And so kind of as Facebook went through that transition, I also personally went through that transition. I was given a choice to stay on the civic engagement team or join the civic integrity team, which the teams were very closely together. But I made a choice then, and it really seemed like in the wake of the 2016 US election that that there's a lot more work to do to clean things up before we start building new things with technology. And I unfortunately, I really do still feel that way, because all of the creative and interesting things that you can do with tech to support innovative new approaches to democracy can be attacked. And we don't have the legal infrastructure or the technical investment from the platform companies to really protect a lot of potentially innovative tools that you could develop. So, I've kind of shifted gears, and I'm much more on, we called this the defense side inside of Facebook. And even though I'm not in that company anymore, I still think I'm kind of playing defense where technology and democracy are concerned.
I just want to underscore something David said towards the end of his comments and add to it, which is, we're not just concerned about the systems being attacked, but we're also concerned about whether they are fit for the purposes that they're being deployed for, and whether there are unintended consequences that would come from their use. And so, of course, we do think there are potential positive uses in the democracy context. So, for example, we have written about how AI could be used to disrupt and distort the common process in public input and policy making and policy implementation. But the converse is also true. So policymakers could, potentially use AI to enhance their consideration of the vast volumes of public input and feedback that they receive, using it to better synthesize and assess that input in a more nuanced way. But that, really needs to be paired with guardrails and safeguards to ensure that any AI systems used are fit for their purpose, that they're not introducing harmful biases into the process or, even diminishing accessibility for people with disabilities. In the election office context, you could also see, potential beneficial uses of AI. Again, this is more the traditional use of AI to process and synthesize information, to identify new polling place locations, optimizing for accessibility, analyzing post-election data, again, to increase and enhance accessibility. You could also, we've heard from some election officials that they are using generative AI in some instances to help them develop products that to sort of review their products for simplicity and accessibility, not as a supplement for the human or the staff member, but as a sort of extra set of eyes. But again, it's really important especially because of the accuracy concerns with generative AI, but also all sorts of concerns with AI in general, to have guardrails to mitigate risks of inaccuracy and bias and lack of fitness for purpose.
Thank you very much. Right. Moving on to the next question. What steps are being taken at a national level, at an international level? Of course, the efforts in the EU were already referenced a moment ago. What steps are being taken at those levels to address the concerns around AI? What are some possible solutions that are being discussed at a national, international level? And Michaela, I'll ask you to go first on this, and then David.
Sure. So I'll mention first off that there are 3 federal bills that were just approved by members of the Senate Rules Committee, which a couple of them do represent a step towards pushing forward legislation in Congress. So the AI Transparency in Elections Act and the Protect Elections from Deceptive AI Act would regulate the use of AI in political ads. And there's also a bill called the Preparing Election Administrators for AI Act that would require the Election Assistance Commission to issue voluntary guidelines for election offices pertaining to AI's impact on election administration, cybersecurity, and disinformation. All 3 of those bills have bipartisan sponsors, and so we'll see how that plays out in Congress. There's also the Biden administration executive order that was published last year. A large focus of the executive order is AI use by federal agencies, given the inherent limitations of the executive branch acting without new authorization from Congress. So in terms of the sort of impacts on the election space, one relevant section requires the federal government to develop techniques for content provenance, watermarking, and detection, and compels OMB to develop guidance on the integration of content provenance standards for official communications by federal agencies. And this could provide a blueprint for election officials to follow, and I hope it does. CISA has the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has put out a resource for election officials that focuses on outside threats posed by generative AI to election offices and election processes, as well as mitigations. It's not the most detailed resource, but it is out there. The federal government has also published draft guidance on generative AI risk management, which does include information security risks, which is of course relevant to election officials. But so far we haven't seen any sort of guidance that is specifically tailored to the use of AI by election administrators. So that is a gap, and it is one that is important to fill in our view. So those are some of the actions that have happened at the federal level, but curious to hear from David as well, what he's seeing.
Thank you very much. David, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Michaela did a great job on the federal roundup. I think the frustration that I've had with federal action around AI and democracy is that it's so limited, the universe of possibility, because of the dysfunction of Congress right now. I mean, look, they can barely pass a budget. How much can we expect from them on complicated technologies? I mean, there was so much excitement around these Senate Insight sessions that, had all these conversations, but what came out of it was really disappointing. I think it's so important to keep pushing and trying, but I'm a little bit of an impatient person, and so that's why I look to Brussels and to California. Excuse me, to California. In Europe, I mentioned the Digital Services Act. I'll go a little deeper on that. So the Digital Services Act has specific language in it that tech companies, specifically if they run what are called very large online platforms or very large online search engines, and that's basically all the big social media companies and all the big search engines qualify as this. They are required to do four things that I think are pretty important for democracy. And the first is to conduct risk assessments. And these risk assessments are a major requirement. The companies need to look internally at all of the possible risks that their that their products pose to society in a number of areas: mental health, problems for minors, but also very specifically elections and democracy. So they have to do this risk assessment. Then they have to propose risk mitigation measures. And then they have to get an independent auditor to come and audit their risk assessment plans and their risk mitigation plans. And that auditor has to verify that what they did is right. And then that's the third thing. And then the fourth thing is that they have to give independent researchers access to data to study these social issues, including, in particular, democracy and elections and how they're impacted through these social media platforms and search engines. And I think those four things are really important. Now, a couple months ago, the Digital Services Act team in Brussels went further, and they released specific guidelines around elections and what the social media platforms and search engines needed to do to comply with the existing DSA guidelines about elections. And that was great. I was really happy about that for a number of reasons, because they gave a lot more detail about what companies needed to do to assess and mitigate risks. And they also started getting into AI. Now, it's an imperfect solution because not all AI companies are also companies that operate search engines or social media platforms, but a lot of them do. And so that those election guidelines, in a way, for a certain set of AI companies, fast track some of the provisions in the EU AI Act. And one in particular I want to call attention to is about the watermarking of AI generated content. So the EU AI Act, which only just recently passed, was finalized in the last couple of weeks and won't come fully into force for about 2 years, will require watermarking, which is the creation of an invisible signal that's embedded into AI-generated content, whether it's images, video, audio, and probably text, that identifies that content as generated by AI. And the great news about these new Digital Services Act guidelines on elections is that they actually require that sooner. And this is because the European Parliament elections are happening imminently, and the EU is just as concerned as we are in the US about the role of AI in the elections. So in theory, the companies that fall into the DSA compliance requirements need to be implementing watermarking right now to address the threats of AI generated content. And that dovetails well with work that I've been doing with Jonathan in Sacramento around a bill called AB 3211 by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. But I think maybe Jonathan will talk about that a little more.
Yeah. Thank you, David, very much. That is my next question. Jonathan, tell us what's happening in California. Please talk about the work that is happening at the legislative level, and how does, as you see it, how does the work that's happening in California potentially compare to other states as well? Please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Mindy, and thanks, David, for teeing it up so perfectly. The new initiative that we established in 2023, the California Initiative for Technology and Democracy, has a legislative package in the state legislature. So before I go into specifics, let me just say that the California State Legislature has sort of the inverse dynamic from Congress, which is to say in Congress, it can be very hard to pass something, and we're dealing with a ton of dysfunction and gridlock. In California, there's like an overactivity happening, in which I think earlier this year, there was at one point over 50 bills that attempted to regulate AI in some way. And the challenge for lawmakers in California and for leadership in California is not, can we pass a bill? It's, can we make sure we pass the right bills and make sure that we're creating a workable, uniform, understandable system of sort of AI governance. And so there's lots of big bills in the space, including from Senator Wiener has a bill that adopts a lot of sort of the European steps that David just outlined. Assemblymember Rebecca Bauer-Cahan has legislation in the AI area, and there's a number of other leaders as well. The California, the cited package, California Initiative for Technology and Democracy, the cited package is really focused on AI's intersection with democracy. And so the first of the three bills is a bill from Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. That's AB 3211. We also call it the Provenance, Authenticity, and Watermarking Standards, so PAWS. But basically, it requires generative AI companies to embed digital provenance data within the digital media that they create. So we know what images, video, and audio were digitally created, when they were created, who they were created by. And it also requires that social media platforms use that digitally embedded provenance data to flag AI fakes as AI fakes. So if you're scrolling Twitter, or you're scrolling Facebook, or you're scrolling Instagram, and something has been AI generated, under the bill, it would require that to carry a small tag somewhere that indicates that it was AI generated. And this is not, to be clear, sort of watermarks that are on the corner of the image or the corner of the video, because those can be photoshopped off. They can be of fake content. They can be photoshopped on to real content, and so further confusion. The idea is that the social media platform would incorporate into the post somewhere around the content or underneath the digital media an indication to its users that the content is fake or synthetic or AI generated. We're hoping that will mitigate some of the examples that we're seeing around the world in which political deepfakes are being passed off as real. The other two bills inside its package are AB 2655. It's a Berman bill. Basically, it fights online election disinformation by requiring social media platforms to label election-related deepfakes posted by users and to ban the worst, most obvious cases of social media deepfakes close to Election Day in a way that is narrowly tailored and respects the First Amendment. And then a companion bill is AB 2339. That's a Pellerin bill. Essentially, it's the offline equivalent. It bans the use of deepfakes that deceive voters about candidates and elections officials in political mailers, robocalls, TV ads, again, in a narrowly tailored way that we hope respects the First Amendment. And the Pellerin bill, the last of those three, it would have made the Joe Biden robocall from New Hampshire, in which immediately before the New Hampshire primary, a robocall of Joe Biden went to Democratic voters urging them to not vote in the primary, that would be illegal under the Pellerin bill. Last thing I want to emphasize, what we're trying to do in California, Mindy, I'm sorry, not the last thing, because Mindy, you asked me what's going on in other states. I think a number of other states are trying to mimic California's deepfake bill from 2019 that allows people to, or allows the state to take some sort of enforcement action against the creator of a deepfake that targets politicians. We think there's a number of problems with that. I think the first is that we don't want to just protect politicians and candidates. We want to protect elections officials, poll workers, the infrastructure of our elections. We want to stop deepfakes of voter fraud that, because we're in a world now where if you have an election conspiracy about voter fraud or the election being rigged, you can create false but confirmatory evidence of your conspiracy theory with the click of a button. And so we want to protect not just candidates and politicians, we want to protect the integrity of our elections. And so we think we need to go further than that 2019 California deepfake bill. Also, we think enabling the state or some other entity doing enforcement work to target the creator of a deepfake is not particularly workable, because if you put a deepfake on Twitter and it's shared 10 million times, and then it's taken, it's reproduced, it's reworked, it's repackaged, it's now it's 1,000 different memes or whatever. If you go after the original creator of that deepfake, first of all, you may not be able to find them. Second of all, they may not be in the United States. But third of all, by the time you're able to take enforcement action against that individual creator of the deepfake, that deepfake is out into the world and it has metastasized and it has been reposted by 1,000 other people. And so we think a system in which we place the burden on the tech companies to get this right on the front end and stop all this ocean of disinformation from entering the democratic discourse in the first place is far more effective than a back-end whack-a-mole approach to enforcement. So what we're trying to do is big and ambitious and has not been attempted in any other state. And so we are working our way through it all now with the help of national leaders and experts like Michaela and through California-based experts like David.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to ask all of you, we've talked about national, touched on international. We want to make sure that we acknowledge any solutions, any innovative solutions, creative solutions that are happening at the local level. So we're a little short on time. So you want to think, this can really go to Jonathan, Michaela, or David. If you have any quick thoughts on what you're seeing at the local level, maybe we'll just kind of shout them out and invite people to look into those a little further on their own. Anyone have some thoughts?
Well, one quick thing is that, in the United States, elections are administered at the local level. And that's why through the Brennan Center, we've been really focused on providing tools to local election officials. And there was a report that I think was distributed in the chat at the very beginning about how local election officials can prepare for AI threats. So I think that's the number one thing I'd recommend. And it's funny because I just testified before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in a meeting of the Rules Committee about elections and AI. And they asked me what legislation San Francisco could pass on this issue. And I said, let's give it a couple months and see what doesn't get through in Sacramento, because we should know that by the fall. But I think that there are lots of good reasons for especially larger cities that can be influential to take steps and legislate things if they are not working or if they're getting blocked at the state and national level.
Thank you, David. Let's also just note, for those of you that are joining us that want to know what you can do or what individuals can do to navigate this new landscape, we've put a lot of resources in the chat already. When we package up this video with Price and send it out to everyone that's registered, we will send all of these links again, as well as some resources for individuals, really focused on how people can spot these deepfakes, how they could be thinking about arming themselves, to or inoculate themselves potentially against some of the impacts. I'd like to end just here. We've got a couple questions in the Q&A, but just as a lightning round for our panel before we get to that, give me 30 seconds. I know 30 seconds, but where do you think we're heading with all of this? I won't ask you to predict what's going to happen specifically coming out of the election, but where do you think we're heading with the conversation of AI and elections and the work that's being done. Jonathan, do you want to go first?
Sure. Let me share where I worry we're headed and where I hope we're headed. What I worry about, there's at least some writing online about, and some commentators who've observed that generative AI, deepfakes, and disinformation haven't changed the outcome of any elections yet internationally, as far as we know. I would argue that's the wrong bar. I think that's the wrong metric. I think what we should really be worried about is that candidates on one side, or the online trolls with one particular point of view, or foreign states trying to get one particular outcome start using deepfakes. The other side feels that they need to use them in return because of an arms race happening in sort of our election environment. Over time, trust in what people are seeing begins to degrade, or continues to degrade. People lose faith in political information and the information they're getting about candidates. And they either say, forget it, I can't understand any of this, it's not worth it, politics is even more disgusting than I thought before, and I'm turning it all off. Or because people don't know what they can trust, they begin to trust what agrees with them and confirms their biases, and they disregard as fake anything that challenges them or doesn't agree with their biases, and we retreat into tribalism. I think that's the pulling apart that is really my biggest concern if we don't take effective action. I think that the more hopeful scenario is that we shift as a society and as a culture how we think about tech regulation and how we think about the governance of powerful new technologies. So every industry in our world that impacts our wellness and well-being is accustomed to regulation. Airlines, car manufacturers, food producers, pharmaceuticals, they are accustomed to regulatory schemes, inspection, testing, standards. Tech companies for now several generations have been able to roll out unbelievably powerful, ubiquitous new products that we know impact our wellness, our mental health. They are reshaping society. They are reshaping our democratic discourse. And there is no similar testing, inspection, regulation, and so forth. They have been able to skate free of regulation by and large for several generations. And I think what we need to understand is that what we were proposing with respect to tech regulation, platform accountability, AI governance, it is not dramatic or radical. We are simply trying to apply the same expectations that we apply to every other industry in our lives to the tech sector. And if we can come to a collective understanding of that, I think we'll be in a better place going forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. Michaela, David?
I'll add one thing that I'm heartened about and a couple of things that I'm worried by. So one thing, I say this in a somewhat speculative manner, but it feels like there is an emerging norm around the use of generative AI in political advertising in the American context, in part because of the passage of laws and the focus of policymakers in this area. And I think that's really encouraging. And I think the causal effect has run from, the passing of laws and the attention given by policymakers to help create this emerging norm. The sort of bigger risks are, an equally big risk, is generative AI deepfakes spread by third-party actors, and that is a somewhat harder issue to tackle. Although there are bills that would address that issue, but we want to make sure that they're done in a prudent and careful way. And then, I think the things that I'm most worried about are the deployment of large language models to potentially engage in persuasion, covert persuasion efforts on a larger scale. That is something that I think won't be as potentially as visible, but could have really nefarious impacts. And then, I'm also worried about the use of AI that we're currently seeing to fuel voter challenges to voters' registration status as well.
All good points. Thank you. David, last word here.
Yeah, well, I think if we like democracy, we're going to have to fight for it. And this is, that's always been true. And I think it's even more true right now. Completely agree with Jonathan. It is very, very unreasonable how the tech industry has managed to evade regulation for such a long time. A lot of that speaks to broader dysfunction in Congress at the federal level here. But also want to maybe challenge something Jonathan said. That I think there is one case where people have argued that an election's outcomes were influenced by AI, and that's the Slovakian election last year, where some argue that an audio deepfake may have changed the outcome to a presidential candidate who was a pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine. So I think we're going to need to grapple with that one. Completely agree with Michaela about covert operations. I think that encrypted platforms in particular, and that's WhatsApp, iMessage, Signal, Telegram, those are places where it's the hardest to track what's going on because of the encryption, where the companies have largely abdicated responsibility for what happens on the platforms because of the encryption, but they don't have to. When users report abuse on those platforms, the companies can choose to investigate. I don't think they're doing enough. And I think that that's why we still get spam on all of those platforms on a regular basis. So, again, if we like democracy, let's fight for it.
Thank you all very much. So just looking at the chat, I know we've run a few minutes over, but this has been a good conversation, an important one. Really just two main questions. One I've already covered, which is people asking for resources, best resources to check if something is AI generated, falsified, or taken out of context. Again, we'll share those resources when we share the video. And the second question is about research. So where do you think research is lacking regarding AI's influence on elections and finding cybersecurity solutions? In other words, what research do you think it needs to be done? That's a big question. If anyone thinks that you want to tackle that or have a thought on that, I noted at the beginning of my PowerPoint that there isn't much research obviously done in this area yet. Thoughts from our panelists?
I responded in the Q&A about the research one. We need to actually do research with platform data. We need to be able to get access to longitudinal data to do long-term studies about the transformation of our political environment with social media and AI. We need to remember that AI is not just generative AI. The system's used to rank what we see in our news feeds online and our Reels and TikTok, et cetera. All of that is ranked with AI. And so we need to be able to study all of that. In the EU, researchers now legally are required to have that kind of access thanks to the Digital Services Act. One of the faculty members at Stanford, Nate Pursley, has spent a lot of time pushing the Federal Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. And that's been reintroduced maybe more than once. And so we need to pass something like that so that the research just can be done, because the research on this can't be done without the participation of the platforms that hold the data that is needed to do the research, and that data is not available to researchers in the US.
Thank you. I'll let David have the last word there, unless there's anything burning from Jonathan or Michaela. Thank you, all of you, David, Jonathan, Michaela, for joining us today, for your thoughts here. We're very fortunate to have them. This is an emerging and incredibly important topic for the 2024 elections and beyond, right? Everyone that has joined us, thank you very much. And again, we're going to be sending out the resources that were mentioned today. They've been in the chat, but we'll send it kind of packaged up along with the video, and addressing some of your questions around resources for individuals to be able to spot and decipher and manage AI-generated images that come their way. And lastly, I just want to thank USC and the Price School of Public Policy for their partnership on this webinar. I am actually, as I think Lance mentioned at the beginning, broadcasting, can we say broadcasting live, the webinar from the brand new USC Washington, D.C. Capitol campus in DuPont Circle. And it's lovely to be here on a muggy but still beautiful day in DC. So thank you all again very much. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks for joining us.